We're looking at the Christian's responsibility in marriage and the family and some of the causes for divorce. And we're looking at some of the tensions that divide marriages and families. I said, I think last time, finances. It's not how much income one has, but how it's spent and who spends it. Religious non-affinity. Worst thing in the world is to be divided spiritually. Attempts to change the pattern of one's mate after marriage, and some other things, didn't I? All right, tonight we'll start there. I believe I just mentioned one other, which is a very significant one, and that is in-law interference. Yeah. Everybody gets married has some in-laws, that is. All right, we're looking at causes for tension in marriage and things that lead to divorce. I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but in a study of 5,000 cases by sociologists, 3 out of 4 had in-law trouble. And if you made a study of 50,000 cases or 500,000 cases, the percentage would be the same, still be at 3 out of 4. And so there are contributing causes to that, like stereotype jokes about mother-in-law and in-laws, which condition couples to expect the worst. Another contributing factor are in-laws who act like in-laws. Now, how can we correct the situation? We've got the problem, so I want to deal with that then first of all tonight. How can we remove or help eliminate the tensions that are leading to such a high rate of divorce in America? 1 out of 4, some areas 1 out of 2 marriages fail. All right, to help correct the situation, first of all, you should treat your in-laws as persons. Now, if we move too rapidly, as I say, well, you can ask for repetition, give you time to write it. Treat your in-laws as persons, not as an enemy to be overcome or endured. I'm talking about 3 out of 4 marriages. So if you're married, you know of what we speak. Most of you would. It isn't 100% true, of course, because some in-laws don't act like in-laws. So treat them as persons. Most people actually get married expecting trouble, is what I'm saying. So they look upon their in-laws as people to be endured or overcome. Secondly, if family problems do arise, and they do, then don't react, act. There's a difference between reacting and acting. Don't react, but act. Now, by acting, I mean, as a Christian, take the initiative to correct the situation in love with the in-laws. And if you say, well, my in-laws are not Christian, you should remember you are. Now, of course, some you can't talk to them, but we're talking about generally you can. So, don't ever react in family situations. Act. Again, always be willing, and I dare say this is what most people would never think of. Always be willing to place yourself momentarily in the in-law's position when there's trouble. Of course, that would be true between employer and employee, husband, wife, parents, children. But certainly true between in-laws and married couples. Be willing momentarily to place yourself in the in-law's position. You know what the first thing is you'll discover? Parents love their children. And if you put yourself in their position before you try to solve the problem, since you know you're right anyway, most people generally know they're right, don't they? If you put yourself in their position, you'll discover parents love their children, and you'll be able to distinguish thereby between meddling and sincere concern by the parents. Sometimes it's just sincere concern and you think it's meddling. So if you'll put yourself in their place, momentarily. As you consider the problem, pray about it, you'll see maybe that they're just maybe overly concerned, but it's just concern. Another thing that helps relieve the tension, helps correct the situation, this probably would apply as advice or counsel better to people contemplating marriage. You need to recognize that no house is big enough for a mother and her daughter, or a son and his mother, at least at the outset of marriage. They've never built a house big enough for two families, especially if they're in-laws. Now, that isn't an absolute. Some of you may be able to raise your hand and say, we have that situation and it's perfect ideal. Well, praise the Lord. But 3 out of 4 would disagree with you. And the best way to make the 3 out of 4 4 out of 4 is to bring mother or daddy in when you first get married. Now, there's a whole realm of responsibility toward one's parents. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about foolish people who go to live with their in-laws because they don't have the faith to believe for the rent and that sort of thing. Genesis 2 teaches leave and cleave. That's what it says. Let's see, I think I remember the expression. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. You see, I didn't get out of order there. Now, the Bible teaches, as I say, help of the parents and responsibility, but parents, as I say, should not expect to live with the children. Now, there can be exceptions, but we're not dealing with what is ideal, but what is actually the fact most of the time. Now, that's an overall general view. Now, from the parents' point of view, I want to make a few remarks. We're trying to relieve the tensions that lead to divorce. This is one of the major causes, in-law interference. From the parents' point of view, don't become a stereotyped in-law. Just don't allow yourself to become what the cartoons and the stories say that they are and the way they act. Now, how is just keep your nose out of somebody else's business is probably the easiest way to express it. Which brings me to the second thing. Recognize your child has grown up and matured and must learn to cope with his or her own marital problems. There's one thing I insist on. I've got 3 daughters and 3 sons-in-laws, and there's one principle we follow. Not that there's any problem, but if they can't handle their own problems, I'm not going to stick my nose in it. Now, if there were spiritual matters involved, that's another problem. We're talking about just the domestic problems that arise. That's for them to settle, and I'd be the first to tell them. Thirdly, in serious disputes, looking from the in-laws' standpoint, in serious disputes, never, really never take sides. See, I said that way so you'd remember it. Never take sides. If you want to divide a marriage, just do it. Counsel with them if they want your help. Pray with them if they want it. If they don't, pray anyway. Pray without them, that is. And remember, you've been married long enough to know that you don't like in-laws interfering with your marriage. We're talking to in-laws now. You've been married long enough to learn 2 things: that you don't want in-laws interfering with your marriage, and the second thing you've learned, since you're married to somebody, it takes 2 to begin a quarrel. And one of them's always your little baby that you think can do no wrong and you take sides on. Well, where else would you learn it if we didn't teach you? All right, how to reduce tensions. We're talking about in-law interference as one of the tensions. Now, how to reduce the tensions and preserve the marriage. These things will work if you'll put them into practice. But we can't help you if you don't believe it enough to put them into practice. How to reduce tensions and preserve marriage is the heading we're dealing with. At the beginning, first of all, before marriage preferably, but some of you it's too late for that, but at the beginning, before marriage, come to an understanding and agreement on the biblical roles of husband and wife. Who's going to be responsible for what? Now we have, I think, 2 tapes on this, the biblical roles of husband and wife, 2 tapes. And you really should listen to those. Even if you've heard them, you should listen again. But if you'll start the marriage with a biblical understanding of what a husband is and his responsibilities, and wife, you won't fall into the snares that most American men and women have. Well, we've said much about that in other discussions, so we'll just leave it at that. Again, how to reduce tensions, preserve the marriage. Again, surrender non-essentials that cause friction and tension. Now, you've got dozens of peculiarities that you could give up or just practice when she or he isn't there. See, that's to both sides. You know, I know all these. I ought to have a perfect marriage, shouldn't I? Well, peculiarities. What you see that tends to cause tensions or irritate the other partner, like, as I said last week, shining your shoes on the bath towel. That's the best thing in the world to shine a shoe on, but most wives don't like it. But from the wife's standpoint, she shouldn't leave her shoes out in the middle of the bedroom floor where you stumble over them in the dark. That's at least half of you have that problem. Because you can tell the ones that have the particular little problems by their reaction. You ought to get up here. You could. Some are busily writing. Yes, I wouldn't want to miss that. The others are really reacting. I mean, there are a lot of. We mention little things because it's the little things that cause the problem. The big things, generally, 2 Spirit-filled Christians can talk over and pray about and so forth. Popping gum. Now you know what bothers me. I'll tell you. It could bother me if I'd let it. Give up the Saturday rituals if they cause problems. Like he has to wash the car every Saturday. She has to do her grocery shopping every Saturday. She couldn't get it done during the week, so when he's got one day off, she's gone half a day shopping. And he wants her to go, somewhere. And well, I guess we're getting through. We can move on to the third point. Give up the little things that cause tension. Surrender those. They're not important. But some people refuse to change anything. Now remember, as we said last week, you can't change your mate. It's utterly, absolutely, emphatically, categorically impossible. You're wasting your time. But God can change us if you pray for us, and vice versa. If we need changing, maybe the problem's in you. That's right. I mean, if something is irritating you and your mate, maybe the problem's in you. Why should that irritate you? Then, if you're told that, if you're never taught that, you'd never think to look in your own spirit or your own heart or your own life to see why does that bother you. And then you go back to, oh yes, when I was 9 years old, that big bully did that to me, and I kind of see that in my husband now. Or whatever it is. You see, maybe it's in you that there isn't anything, that's really bad about it. Did I ever give you the third? Oh, okay. Now this you may not appreciate till I explain it, but a reserved sense of humor preserves a lot of marriages. A reserved sense of humor. Now, I don't mean foolishness, I'm talking about something else. The ability to treat a situation in a light manner often avoids quarrels. If one of the other can just kind of laugh it off and smile and make light of it, the quarrel doesn't get started. and the other sees how ridiculous he or she is to carry it on, so they just drop it. So a reserved sense of humor, boy, I'll tell you, that can stop a lot of quarrels before they get started. It takes two to quarrel, remember, and quarrels are what lead to divorce, in case you haven't caught that yet. So to be able to react in a manner in which you treat the thing as if it isn't important, or that you have made a silly mistake, just say I have, often can avoid a quarrel. Say, well, how foolish of me, instead of trying to defend yourself. Just say, well, wasn't that foolish? Or to laugh about it. Now, that's not unimportant for you married people. Those of you who haven't started yet, you'll find out if you start that way. Because that just breaks the tension immediately. That's happened, out of experience. I know my wife has at times reacted the right way. Something tend to upset me and she'd just kind of laugh about it or say something light about it, and there's nothing else. You don't carry it on. Oh, you say, I didn't know that you ever... Well, I don't. I don't get upset. That's my confession. But there have been times when, when I'd be tempted to let something bother me, but she wouldn't carry it on. See, she'd stop it right away. Oh, yes, look how silly that was. I shouldn't have done that, or something like that, You'd be surprised. Well, no, you wouldn't be surprised. Again, and this is very important, how to reduce tensions that lead to divorce, break up marriages. Again, in serious matters, and some of them are, there are 6 important principles to obey. 3 don'ts and 3 do's. In serious matters. 6 important principles. 3 don'ts, first of all. Don't argue. If it's serious especially, don't argue. Secondly, don't withdraw within with hurt feelings and not discuss it. Thirdly, don't ever retaliate. Now that's Bible. Don't ever retaliate. Don't try to get even, because husbands and wives have a lot of little ways to get even with one another. Sociologists know that husbands and wives have ways to manipulate one another or to retaliate. And since we're several thousand years old, the human race, people have learned some things about repetitious habits and things that take place in marriage. And it's a fact, a sociological fact, that there are 2 major weapons if you're retaliating, or 2 major tools if you're trying to manipulate the other partner. And the husband uses finance and the wife uses sex. Now those are sociological facts. If he doesn't get his way, he withholds finances. And he can get to her quicker that way than... and of course, then she retaliates with being withdrawn in marital privileges. Now those are ways of manipulating. If a wife wants something, she becomes seductive and uses flattery and so forth. And if a husband wants to achieve something, then he buys her a present and so forth. So these are facts. So don't retaliate. Don't try to manipulate your partner in a serious matters. We're talking about serious matters. Those are the 3 don'ts. The do's, in serious matters, do engage in calm discussion. Not shouting, calm discussion. Never, and here's where most of you miss it. Took me years to learn it, but I believe I've learned it. Never agree to discuss a thing to justify your position. Be willing, like in the mother-in-law or the in-law rather situation, be willing to put yourself in the other's place while you're discussing. and view it from their standpoint as best you can. And you may discover you're wrong, or that if you're not wrong, that it's not so important after all, that you can come to terms on. I'm talking about big things that really could cause a problem and divide a marriage. Don't come together to justify yourself, but try to see the other person's side, with the desire to change if you see you're wrong. One of the most blessed events that will ever occur in your marriage, it will happen to you sometime where you say, where you're calmly discussing, well, you know, I see where I'm wrong about this. You can actually come to the place where you can hear yourself saying that. And it'll do more to restore right relationships than anything in the world. Can you imagine hearing yourself saying you're wrong? Well, if you listen to the other side, you might discover you are. Another do, pray together. Prayer, not, again, you know, with that resigned to your fate tone in your voice. I've done all I know to do, Lord. You just have to take over the situation, because I don't know anything else to try or to attempt. I've come to the end of myself, but we know that you're able. No, use some of that faith that you're always talking about when you're claiming healing or something. Pray together. And the third do is determine to solve your problems yourself without outside help. Now, I don't mean without God's help, of course, I've already said that, but without counseling. In America, we've got counselitis. Every little thing that arises in a marriage, people are encouraged to run to their pastor, to their parents, or to a marriage counselor, to a psychiatrist, or someone. Counselitis. Be willing to work out serious matters yourself if you're Christians. That means you're both Christians, of course. If you're married to someone that isn't, you've got a bit of a problem. Or you could have. That is a problem with respect to doing it this way. You'll have to resort to prayer. And if the situation is such that you just don't know what to do and feel the only alternative is to talk to your pastor, then that's between you and the Lord. But don't approach a situation like this is the way to do it. We don't need counselors. I say all the time that the church doesn't need counselors. Jesus wasn't a counselor. If you pay the cost of getting the Word in your heart and just be willing to surrender your pride and your self-life to be crucified, why, that'll be the answer. Again, solve your problems day to day as they arise. Ephesians 4:26, let not the sun go down on your wrath. Solve them as they arise. Don't carry them over. Don't withdraw. Don't exhibit hurt feelings and figure out ways that, well, I'll make him or her pay. I just won't talk or whatever. Amen. But settle your problems day to day. Again, practice Philippians 4:8. I'm giving you advice free that a psychiatrist charge you $30, $40 an hour, and you wouldn't get the same advice. All of this right out of the Word and experience. It'll work. Amen. Philippians 4:8. Practice it. What is Philippians 4:8? Well, it's the way to victory, and not practicing it is the way to defeat, and most people are defeated right in the realm of the thoughts and the mind. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be anything to praise, then think on these things. Practice that. Don't sit around and imagine the worst over every situation that arises in your marriage. You see, you're defeated. Satan knows where to defeat the Christians in the thought realm. And you're defeated, first of all, there. So don't sit around and try to imagine this or that and the other about the situation. You'll always make it worse than it is. Don't think the worst. So keep in mind the devil defeats you in the thought realm. I mean, why practice this principle about healing, ignoring symptoms and not thinking negative? Why practice this principle about what you're praying about, but ignore it in marriage? You see, it'll work there too, to think on all those good things. Don't sit around and imagine the worst and try to... Well, the devil will plant thoughts in your mind and he'll make it 10 times worse than it is, and then you end up with the troubles that a lot of people have. 3 out of 4. Well, if Christianity is worth living, then it's worth living at home. If it doesn't work in marriage, it isn't going to work anywhere else. God speaks rather to individuals. He isn't speaking to your wife. He isn't speaking to your husband. He's speaking to you. See, because I'll smile when I say this so nobody get mad, but at least a fourth, probably I'm being conservative then, a fourth applied at how many I don't know of those principles to their mate. And you missed the whole point. You said, that's right, I can see where he's missing it. Yes, she is that way, isn't she? So the Lord is talking to us. He isn't talking to your wife or to your husband, He's talking to you. Well, there's a lot of meat there on those bones, so there's a whole lot there for you to consider and to think about. Because if we'll practice them, the marriage will work. Praise the Lord. Anyone have a valid question? Valid question? About your husband or wife? Or a couple you know, so you won't give it away?
Not getting into an argument there with your children, except in spiritual matters. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, when I said don't take sides, maybe that's where it came out. That wouldn't imply that you wouldn't have a position about spiritual matters, but you don't take sides. Some actually take sides if it's their daughter with the son-in-law, so it's just as bad one way or another. Don't take sides is what I was saying. But spiritual matters are important. Here you'd use your faith and claim what would need to be done if you couldn't work it out with them spiritually. You wouldn't ignore spiritual matters. They would be of first importance, of course. But at the same time, you wouldn't step into a situation just because it is spiritual. That's still in-law interference until you've been directed to the Lord, to take some specific action besides prayer, which is too involved to try to say this is what you do in a specific situation. You just have to wait until it happens. Did we thoroughly muddle you on that one? I think it's clear enough that if there are problems, stay out of the way. But if there are spiritual matters that they're not aware of, then you should ask a mature person, ask if you could talk to them about it and approach it that way. That's what I had in mind. I do remember saying that now. I meant when I said don't get involved except spiritual matters, I didn't mean you should ignore something that they're not seeing. They may be under deception about something and getting ready to join submitted body or something. You'd say, I'd like to talk to you, your son-in-law, or your daughter and son-in-law together. And sure, you would. Okay. Ready to start another heading? All of that has been part 1. You could call it introduction or whatever, and we come to part 2 of our study under divorce and remarriage. You see, we're under that heading, divorce and remarriage. The big heading is Christian responsibility and marriage the family or courtship and marriage. But under the heading of divorce and remarriage, we're coming now to the point 2, which is the biblical view of divorce and remarriage. Biblical view. You see, divorce and remarriage, marriage itself, courtship, is one of the biggest questions, probably the most involved and important question you get involved in besides your salvation or the Christian experience. Because we're people, God established marriage and families, and they have children who in turn get married. That makes you an in-law, whether you want to be one or not. And so what we're talking about is where you live every day. Your name and address is on this subject. So the biblical study of divorce and remarriage. All the other was introductory. Now, first of all, I'd like to give briefly the viewpoint of situation ethics on divorce and remarriage. Now, you'll have to go back to where we told you what situation ethics is. Situation ethics, whatever the situation requires, you conform to it. And it doesn't really matter in many churches and denominations today. It doesn't matter so much what the Word of God says, that we've got to adjust ourselves to contemporary needs and the complexities of society. What the situation requires is the way we react to it. And so you may be amazed at how many pastors and churches practice situation ethics in marriage, divorce, and remarriage, if nowhere else. And so I want to introduce you to the popular view before we actually look at the biblical teaching as a necessary preparation for understanding that. So I'll do a little reading here because I've made some quotes. In a book called The Right to Remarry, which already the title, as I said, generally gives away the book, the position of the author. Like Sunday I said when I read the title to an article, Faith or Presumption, I didn't have to read any further because when it's faith or anything else, I know the author's mixed up. Because the Bible teaches nothing but faith. So in a book called The Right to Remarry, written by a professing Christian, what do you suppose he's going to conclude with a title like that? I don't know that you want to take all this down, of course, but you might want to know generally what situation ethics believes about marriage and divorce, because this is where most of the church, the position they're at. Most pastors and denominations. He says, first of all, not every ethical teaching in the Bible is for all people alike. That you can't universalize things like divorce, Jesus' teachings on divorce and remarriage, or going to court in lawsuits, or maybe cases where the only way you could preserve your business would be go to court, and so on and so forth. So every ethical teaching does not apply to everyone alike. So he's leading up. You see, he's going to set his own principles then to grant divorce and remarriage as scriptural. Secondly, the author said that the ethical teachings of the Bible must be divided into 3 periods. First, the Old Testament dispensation. And there we see, on the basis of Matthew 19, that God allowed divorce because of the hardness of their hearts. That is, Moses did. Moses granted divorce because of the hardness of their hearts. And allowed remarriage. So divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament age of Mosaic law was permissible. He's saying we must divide the ethical teaching into 3 periods. Secondly, we must divide the ethical teaching into the future kingdom age, the millennium, when Jesus comes, the future kingdom age, when there will be a perfect fulfillment of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, if you write your own commentary on the Bible, you can say what you want, you see, which is what he's doing. There will be a perfect age during the kingdom when the kingdom law, the laws of the kingdom, which he says is the Sermon on the Mount, gives the laws of the kingdom. And then there will be no divorce and remarriage. Because in the sermon, Matthew 5, Jesus forbids it. I guess you remember that. Matthew 5, he forbids divorce and remarriage. except for the one grounds that we will discuss later. Then the third ethical age in which we must divide the teachings of the Bible up is the present interim church age of grace. Notice I slipped grace in there, didn't you? The present interim church age of grace. Old Testament law granted divorce and remarriage. The kingdom age, it'll be the perfect ideal age in the millennium, so there'll be no divorce and remarriage. But he says the present interim between the two dispensations is the church age of grace. And he says marriage without divorce is the ideal, but if a marriage fails, like 1 out of 4 does, but if marriage fails, then God's grace and forgiveness immediately applies and also allows a new start with another partner. Well, that's what he says. And that's what you'll get in your average seminary, too. Now, you have to understand situation ethics, as I said, to know where the church's thinking is, what their position is on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. You'll find very, very few pastors who won't marry just anybody, period. There are some who will marry only Christians. You'll find very few who will ask them any questions. And fourthly, you'll find still fewer who will ask them biblical, scriptural questions. Have you been married before? And so forth. Which is the first thing I always ask them. So this raises questions, this man's view. Popular book in Christian circles, of course. Raises the questions. He says, that in the present interim church age that God's grace and forgiveness applies and they should be allowed to remarry. The question is, how many times are they allowed to try to make it work? Jesus forbids divorce, but he says, but that's the ideal situation out in the kingdom age that he's talking about. Well, if you open the door, then why would you say once or twice or 3 times? Why not have 7 times as Mickey Rooney? Or is it 8? And so on. Secondly, it raises a question in my mind, looking at the sermon, is how could there be fornication and adultery in the perfect kingdom age? If the sermon's for the kingdom, and he says there be no divorce and remarriage, then why is this a law for the kingdom? I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication. You mean we're going to have divorce and fornication in the millennium? We've got that already. What kind of millennium is that? And causes her to commit adultery. If he puts her away, whosoever shall marry her that's divorced commits adultery. So how could you have that pertaining in the millennium? And anyway, just superficial reading of the sermon shows you that it's not for the future, that it applies now. Why? Because you see there's evil present. We have enemies that we are to pray for. Sin is present. There are many things present that show it's now. You won't have those things in the millennium. He says, resist not evil. Don't go to law with anyone. If they take your coat, give them your cloak also. Are we going to have people stealing from us in the millennium? Well, obviously, it isn't the laws of the kingdom. It isn't laws to begin with. And kingdom hasn't come whenever the sermon is to be applied anyway, because in chapter 6, verse 10, he says to pray, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. We're to pray for it to come. So how could we be praying that in the millennium if the sermon's for the millennium, if it's already come? But we dealt with that earlier on the sermon. You can go back and look at your detailed notes there. Another situation ethic teacher states that divorce is sinful. Quite an admission. Divorce is sinful, but once it's happened, the pastor should help each individual confess their guilt and then prepare them for accepting responsible commitment in a new marriage. That's the pastor's responsibility. The church then should respond with healing grace and restore them to full fellowship and ministry in the church. You'd wonder if these people that stand in the pulpit that say these things, if they've ever read the Bible. He's asking us, the pastor and the church, to unite to defy the clear teaching of the Word of God. That's what he's saying. He says, pastor and church, you unite to defy the word. If he'd read the sermon, he'd find out one thing, that whoever does what's here will be blessed, and those who don't are going to be dealt with. And he's teaching contrary to what Jesus says. Then again, a Baptist church in Texas holds seminars for divorced couples, for couples in all stages of divorce. They have 700 single adults, many of them who are divorced. They appeal to the divorced people. Because they have so many, they have special classes called divorce support groups who minister to divorced people, or people who are in stages of divorce. Pastor ought to, as he pronounces the marriage vows, he ought to say, not until death do you part, but until divorce do you part. In one case, this particular church, their youth leader is divorced. We won't even raise the question of the kind of influence that a leader would have on youth who are getting ready, preparing for marriage if their leader's already failed. But the pastor justifies appointing him, a divorced person, to lead the youth by saying, well, he's now able to help the youth avoid his mistake. It took the divorce, he said, to cause him to think seriously about the responsibilities of marriage. Well, praise the Lord. I have to laugh to keep from crying. How do these people get in the pulpits? How can people, because, in all the churches I know of, either the board has to appoint you and you have to be examined by them, you have to know something, or the churches I'm acquainted with, like the Baptists, they call their pastors after they've heard them preach and talked to them. How could you call a person that didn't have any more biblical sense and to make a statement like that? See, if he's now able to better lead the youth because of his own mistake, and now he can help them avoid making the same mistake, we could justify we ought to hire people, that have failed in the area of drugs and alcoholism and gambling and sex. And where's the limit on such reasoning? Well, anyway, the Bible, talking about restoring them to ministry, the Bible is clear enough on that. 1 Timothy 3, he's to be the husband of one wife if he's a minister. And that doesn't mean one at a time. That means one period. Then the idea that he's able now to help them because he's failed. We're not talking about a person that has failed as a sinner in the area of business or drinking problem and so forth, but now he's saved and married and divorced. That makes him a good leader of the youth, and he's able to understand the seriousness of marriage because he failed. As I say, you might as well hire people who failed in every realm as Christians, as your leaders. That just doesn't make any sense to me. I remember one Baptist brother, I forget just what it was, but it's years ago, and the evils of Hollywood and all, he was trying to justify it. One of the Baptist deacons, letting his children go see some of the lousiest kind of pictures you could imagine. And he justified it to this other brother who was telling me about it, another deacon, by saying, well, Brother John, we'll call him, they're going to have to face these things out in the world, and I'd rather for them to learn them there in the movie house than to find them out in the gutter and so forth, and this is life, this is reality. Oh, he said in reply, is that right? Well, let's see, the son, I think, was 14. He says, after church tonight, I'll just take your son with me, we'll go down to the saloon. That's in the days of saloons. There are bars now. Saloon, the pool hall, and we'll just get first-hand evidence and information about how the other side lives. Oh, I don't want you taking my son in a place like that, he said. Well, he said, you wanted realism. And we'll learn what all the swear words are in one evening and see them drinking and drunking, and drinking. So if you're looking for realism, it's a little ridiculous. I feel like I'm standing up here justifying it, but it's a little ridiculous to me that the person couldn't see through that immediately. And how a church would put up with that and call itself Baptist, I don't know. Then a divorcee who wrote a book on the subject, a Christian who had a divorce not on biblical grounds, in reply to the question, will you remarry, said, yes, if the Lord brought someone into my life and I knew it was of God. Well, obviously she's never read the Bible, and yet she wrote a book on the subject to counsel us. Said if the Lord sent her somebody, well, all she'd have to do is read and see that God forbids divorce, and He isn't going to send a divorcee somebody to marry, so she'll be in adultery. Well, situation ethics. And they never raise the questions, biblical questions, is what I'm trying to get across to you about what does God have to say about all this. Or does He have anything to say? All right, that's where we'll stop and start next time.